Get ready for a wild ride. Imagine we squeezed the entire history of life on Earth into a single year. In this cosmic marathon, we Homo sapiens, the newbies, barely show up in the last 2 days. Yep, we're the latecomers. But hold on, those 2 days are 350,000 years of real-time action, with Earth surfing through calm eras and others of total chaos. Now, if we tossed you into a time machine and dropped you right at the moment of our big debut, you'd land on a mind-blowing, alien, and totally out-of-control planet. Ready to open your eyes and see what madness awaits? Back then, Homo sapiens were confined to the African continent and stayed put there for quite a while, not moving around much. It wasn't until about 70,000 years later that modern humans started to spread out, or at least those were the ones who left descendants to populate the world. During that long stretch in Africa, our ancestors encountered a huge variety of landscapes and, more importantly, animals that today, for better or worse depending on how you look at it, no longer exist. Maybe the first things that pop into your mind are stuff like saber-toothed tigers, weird-looking stegodonts, or other bizarre Ice Age critters. But while those creatures roamed other parts of the world, they weren't what the first modern humans saw. In fact, many of the iconic animals we associate with recent prehistory never lived in Africa or had already vanished from the continent by the time we evolved. Instead, Africa was on a totally different vibe from other regions. The extinct animals there were a lot like the ones still around today, but with a slight twist. A great example is elephants bigger than some species in the tyrannosaur family, like the Paleoloxodon. This extinct elephant looked a lot like the ones we know today, especially from a distance. But get up close and you'd notice its proportions were off. This mammal was an absolute giant, considered the largest land mammal to ever walk the earth. Yet, oddly enough, it's also the smallest elephant that ever existed. How's that possible? Well, there were several species in this genus, and their sizes varied wildly. Most went extinct long ago, and the ones that lingered were outside Africa, except for one, the Paleoloxodon falconeri. This species, dating back about 13,000 years, wasn't the biggest of the Paleoloxodon lineup, but it was up there. It likely descended directly from the second largest member, the Paleoloxodon recci. From the few remains we have, it seems the falconeri was almost as massive as its ancestor, which is insane. Estimates put the recci at 4.2 meters tall at the shoulder and weighing 15.3 tons. That's heavier than any known theropod and 50% bigger than the heftiest savanna elephant alive today. With that size, it won't surprise you to hear that their tusks were massive too. But even for a 15-ton elephant, the Paleoloxodon's tusks were colossal. This genus had the largest tusk-to-body ratio of any known elephant. Some tusks were as long as the entire body of certain elephant species. Plus, they were straighter than usual and hung closer to the ground, letting the falconeri easily smack small objects or interact with the earth. Maybe it even used its tusks like a shovel in some situations. And to make it even more imposing, those skull protrusions I mentioned earlier are thought to have had a special purpose. Are you enjoying what you're watching? If so, consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps me keep creating content like this for you. It costs you nothing, and it motivates me a lot to keep making more videos. So if you want to support the channel, go ahead and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss anything. The idea behind making the tusks deadlier was that they acted as anchors for a bunch of huge muscles that supported their heads. This let them swing their weapons with more force and speed. At this point, you'd think any creature with a shred of common sense would realize messing with a supercharged giant elephant was a bad idea. Yet researchers believe modern humans might have hunted these beasts. There's no hard proof, but we know other Homo species in Eurasia hunted and butchered similar-sized Paleoloxodons with spears, and by then, we had javelins too. That said, if this hunting happened, it probably wasn't an everyday thing. Paleoloxodon was the biggest animal on the continent, and any attempt would have been packed with risks. Besides, there were plenty of other giant animals to pick from, smaller and less equipped. Though that didn't always make hunting easier, smaller doesn't always mean easy. A solid example is the Syncerus antiquus, aka the giant buffalo. Sure, it was way smaller than the Paleoloxodon, but this extinct bovid was still a legit threat. In fact, it's the largest bovid to ever live in Africa. Adults stretched about 3 meters long and stood 1.85 meters tall at the shoulder, taller than most moose. They were covered in dense muscle and had sturdy bones that gave them serious heft. The biggest males could weigh up to 2.2 tons, on par with the white rhino, the largest rhino alive today. But here's the difference. Rhinos have armored skin that adds to their weight, while the Cincerus antiquus was all muscle, bone, and a bit of keratin. And speaking of keratin, these buffalo had horns that had put any rhino to shame. Each horn jutted out to the sides, slightly curved and crazy long, possibly over a meter each, similar to those of water buffalo, their relatives. In the biggest individuals, tip to tip, they might have spanned 3 meters, about the diameter of a basketball hoop, longer than the horns of most ceratopsians, including some nearly 3 times their size. To support that massive body and those giant horns, the giant buffalo probably had to chow down on huge amounts of plants. And since they moved in big herds, they left a massive mark on the environment, carving wide paths with their stomping. Thanks to this, they were pretty easy to track, which let some bold predators, like humans maybe, go after them. Though finding one was way easier than killing it because they had zero qualms about using those horns. We know this from records we left behind. These buffalo popped up a lot in African rock art, usually shown mid-fight, almost always with other males. Most were drawn with their heads lowered, ramming rivals with their horns. These brawls were so common, they hold the record for the most depicted violent scenes, suggesting this bovid had a seriously explosive temper. It probably didn't hurt that they could charge at 56 kilometers per hour, meaning anything they crashed into, except maybe a Paleoloxodon, was getting totally wrecked. But not their massive horns, nor their size, nor their ferocity stopped us from hunting them. Or the other us, other human species. As you probably know, several Homo species have walked the Earth, but people often forget it wasn't a straight line leading to us, with each species neatly replacing the last. In reality, there was a lot of overlap between them, and it peaked when the first modern humans showed up. About 300,000 years ago, 4 Homo species were living in Africa at the same time. Not necessarily in the same spots, but close enough that we could have bumped into each of them separately. Alongside sapiens, you had Naledi, Rhodesiensis, and Heidelbergensis, so there was plenty of variety. By then, a couple of these species had already been around for hundreds of thousands of years, while we were the new kids on the block. Though they all looked a lot like us, it's fair to assume our ancestors saw them as different, especially the Naledi, who were the oddballs of the bunch. This archaic human was pretty primitive compared to the others and resembled the even older Australopithecus, a hominid they descended from. Like them, Naledi were built for trees. Their bodies suggest a more arboreal lifestyle, and they weren't great at running on land. They were also tiny, one of the smallest human species ever, with matching small brains. So far, they haven't been linked to any material culture, which might mean they had less tech and maybe couldn't keep up with us or the other Homo species. Plus, their diet wasn't exactly competitive. They ate rough food scraped off the ground, full of dust or dirt, something you can see in their worn-down teeth. So, to modern humans, it would have been obvious these guys were a different breed. But with the others, the line was blurrier, especially with Heidelbergensis. While Naledi are only known from South Africa, Heidelbergensis turn up across several African countries and eventually left the continent. Overall, they were pretty similar to modern humans, same height, similar brain size, but they leaned a bit more Neanderthal-like, with broad chests and stocky builds that made them tougher and probably stronger than us. Let's just say, in a fight between them and us, I know who I'd bet on. They also had tech on par with ours. Their remains are often tied to fire use, primitive shelters, spears, hand tools, and even art. These advancements let them spread across a big chunk of Africa, where they thrived on a mostly meat-based diet, specializing in hunting big animals. This overlap in diet and territory could have sparked clashes with Homo sapiens, maybe even violent ones. But here's the twist. There's also a chance those interactions were settled with words, or rather, sounds, instead of fists. Studies of their hyoid bones and middle ears suggest they might have had human-like speech and an early form of language. That would have helped them team up, and sure enough, some sites show advanced cooperation. For example, in Kenya, there's a spot with over 50 butchered theropods, proof that Heidelbergensis weren't messing around. This operation probably involved Rhodesiensis too, a slightly older species known from Zambia. They were so similar to Heidelbergensis that a lot of folks think they were the same thing, not a separate species. Either way, it's clear these two, Rhodesiensis and Heidelbergensis, were smart and pretty close to modern humans, making any contact between them and us a juicy topic. So far, there's no solid evidence of direct interactions, but at least one study claims we mixed a little with Heidelbergensis in sub-Saharan Africa. Some even argue they could be our direct ancestors, though that idea's taken some heat in recent years. It's still on the table, but it's shrouded in mystery. And just like our murky relationships with other Homo species, there's another gray area tied to a baboon-like creature, one of the scariest things nature ever cooked up, the Dinopithecus. For now, it's a gamble whether this primate ever crossed paths with sapiens. Its fossil remains are super scarce, and it might have gone extinct before we showed up. But it was such a weird, creepy critter that I feel it deserves a shout-out. Its name literally means terrible monkey. And the Dinopithecus was a primate bigger than the average man, with some specimens tipping the scales at 77 kilograms. It came loaded with deceptively powerful muscles and a massive skull housing menacing fangs, 20% bigger than those of today's largest baboons. So far, fossils have only turned up in South Africa and Ethiopia, where it's thought to have lived a bit like baboons, more on the ground, roaming the land rather than swinging from trees. That makes a run-in with them more likely if our timelines overlapped. However, unlike baboons and most of their close relatives, the Dinopithecus didn't eat much grass or typical savanna grub. Instead, it gorged on fruit and maybe even the occasional chunk of meat. Paleontologists think it was an opportunistic eater, likely chowing down on more meat than most primates up to that point. Plus, with its size and those ferocious fangs, some reckon older, smaller Homo species might have been on its menu now and then. The good news? Thanks to our size and tech, we were probably safe. I don't wish any harm on our ancestors, but it'd be awesome if they really did cross paths with this wild baboon. And beyond this guy, there was another animal that matched the Dinopithecus in weirdness, though it wasn't nearly as dangerous, and definitely lived alongside us, the Rusingorix, aka the dinosaur gnu. Yeah, it looked a bit odd compared to modern artiodactyls with its long, thick neck, but you couldn't tell how truly bizarre it was just by looking. You'd need your ears because while this animal didn't look like a dinosaur, it sure sounded like one, specifically a hadrosaur. When they discovered it, paleontologists noticed that inside its skull, the Rusingorix had big, trumpet-like nasal structures, unlike anything seen in other mammals but eerily similar to those of hadrosaurs. In fact, the design is so unique that researchers don't know of any other animal, aside from some lambeosaurines, with that anatomy. The scientists who found it think it evolved this instrument through convergent evolution, thanks to a lifestyle like the hadrosaurs. Both lived in big herds in open areas where a standout way of communicating would have been super handy. Plus, both hadrosaurs and Rusingorix had highly specialized diets, and that's why their teeth, indirectly, might have led to the development of unique skull structures and, as a result, those quirky nasal passages. For the Rusingorix, it's thought they could produce sounds much deeper than their normal vocal range, even dipping into infrasound if they wanted. Frequencies so low humans can't hear them. In other words, they could have been having a shouting match and still been as quiet as a library. Maybe that silence is making you hungry, and I say that because out of all the animals mentioned so far, the Rusingorix is the only one with bone evidence proving sapiens hunted it. In Kenya, they found a group with butchery marks alongside human tools, and the way they died suggests humans likely hunted these new-sized bovids en masse. Some even think humans were the ones who drove them to extinction. Another animal that went extinct, though probably not because of humans, is one that at first glance seems super familiar, the Metridiacoris, an extinct pig that could have easily subbed in for Pumbaa in The Lion King, since it was pretty much a dead ringer for the warthogs we know today. In fact, it's thought to be a direct ancestor of them. The big difference, though, is that this warthog look-alike was seriously chunky. The average specimen was as big as the largest warthogs alive now, measuring about 1.52 meters long, which is already impressive. But where things get wild is the weight, because while you can find warthogs that long today, the Metridiacoris was insanely compact. So compact that one of its species is literally called compactus. Some individuals could weigh more than double a modern warthog of the same length, with estimates suggesting over half a ton for the biggest ones. Basically, a horse-shaped pig. And as you know, warthogs can be a bit cranky and aggressive, a trait this ancient pig probably shared. That gets even scarier because the Metridiacoris had 4 tusks, longer, sharper, and straighter than those of today's warthogs, making its head look almost like a stegosaurus. Like its living relatives, it probably used those tusks for all sorts of things, including fighting, so you definitely want to steer clear. Tricky though, since it roamed across much of the continent and lived an active life, grazing around. But this animal and the others I've mentioned weren't the only familiar faces of the era. There were also way more types of rhinos, zebras, and giraffes. Unlike the pig, these weren't necessarily monstrous in size compared to their relatives, but they had their own quirks. For example, there was a zebra species that lived in the Sahara, a place where you won't find zebras today. Then there was a giraffe a bit taller than the modern ones, which sometimes ventured out of Africa, with most of its fossils popping up in Turkey. And maybe the coolest of all, a hairy rhino, the Stephanorinus hematucus, or steppe rhino for short. Unlike today, this rhino hung out in North Africa over 200,000 years ago. Compared to modern rhinos, it preferred slightly cooler habitats, which probably explains its sparse fur. That fur made it look a bit like a woolly rhino, though it wasn't as big, more like a white rhino in size. And despite being called a steppe rhino, you could actually find this rhinoceros patrolling forests and wooded areas where we know it often crossed paths with humans. How do we know? Well, let me break it down. Hominins, including early modern humans, have been hunting megafauna for hundreds of thousands of years. Several sites have given us evidence of the hunting and butchering of this animal, like a set of stone tools in Jordan dating back about 250,000 years. It might sound wild that ancient humans could take down such a huge beast with basic tools, but through experiments, I found those weapons were way more capable than you'd think. Simple wooden javelins can easily pierce vital organs if they slip between the ribs, and stone tips can even shatter bones. By then, humans had developed sophisticated stone tools mounted on spears and likely thrown. With the right strategy, these people could bring down anything in their world. There's also evidence we held this creature in high regard and respect, at least if it's tied to Neanderthals. The steppe rhino was one of the few animals that sometimes became a trophy for Neanderthal hunters, with skulls kept, probably as prizes. Interestingly, though there's tons of proof this animal was hunted, one study found little evidence that its disappearance around 35,000 years ago was linked to overhunting by humans. Like with many Pleistocene extinctions, it's a debated topic. After this video, swing by my channel to learn about the feared animals the first Native Americans encountered, the evidence of their interactions, and how effective their stone tools were. Back to the point, this fits a broader trend. While a lot of animals went extinct in Africa during the late Pleistocene, it seems they were doomed with or without us. Compared to the rest of the world, Africa managed to hang on to a surprising amount of its megafauna, a key reason why extinct humans didn't see a crazy number of bizarre creatures. In short, the weirdest ones are still with us.